All right, we are going to be making this animation here. It totally loops. It's totally procedural with geometry nodes. There's some stuff to talk about first before we dive into it. Now, this animation is kind of based on a Plexus idea where all these points are connecting and it's really cool. And that has been something that I've made on the channel several times throughout the years, the more I've learned Blender, but every single one of those tutorials didn't quite add up to what I wanted it to be, up until Zan3D posted this tutorial where he showed how to get every single point to connect to every single point. That is the basic concept of what I have been wanting to do for a really long time. So if you want to go really in depth in this process on why this works, I highly encourage you to watch Zan's tutorial. In fact, even if you watch my tutorial, go watch his channel is amazing, but that video is really, really good. All right, so just like any geometry node scene, we're gonna go ahead and start with a plane, and we're gonna run into the geometry nodes workspace to start this out. So we're gonna go ahead and delete the input, and let's build the points that we're gonna get connected to each other. Usually I'm using geometry that exists and then connecting those points. We're actually just gonna create points within a volume. So let's get we're going to get a UV sphere, if I can type it in correctly. Cool. So let's get our UV sphere, plug it in, and we'll make him zoom in here. And then we'll get a mesh to volume node, and that's going to allow Blender to recognize there's actually something can go on inside of it. And then we're going to get a distribute points in volume, and now we can get all of those points to be hanging out with each other and within the volume rather than connecting on the shell. So now that we have this is essentially, the base here. And now let's get all of these points to connect to each other. So we're going to get a for each element node. So if you've never used this before, it can be pretty involved, but we're going to do just very minimal amount of nodes to get this to work. So we're just going to plug the points into the geometry, and then the lower green circle, we're going to plug into geometry, and we can start putting some stuff in here. So what we want to do is get the position of all of those points we just created. So we're going to get a position node, and rather than plug it in to something in here, we're going to use the fact that this is a for each element node and get a position right here. And what it's going to do is going to go set a position for every element that it's seeing. So the elements we put in here are points. Now we're going to get a position for each one of those individual points. And that's one of the powers of this for each element node. So now we're going to get a curve line, and this is going to be the curve line that connects to all the points. So the curve line has to start somewhere. So this is a curve. We have to tell it where do we want the curve to start and where do we want the curve to end. And that is going to be connecting. So we need basically one curve on each point, and then it connects to all the other ones, and that on all of them. So the first start would be the position of all of our points. And you can't see the points now, but they're there, and we're telling it start there. And then I guess we can just go ahead and plug him into the geometry. So now you can see that's all of our points there, but I'm going to snip that. And what we need to do now is get another for each element node. And we're going to plug him into him and just have them hang out together. And I'm going to have him under him. So what we need to do now is see these points. We're just going to plug them into this data here. And we're going to get a sample index node. And let's get another position node. And this needs to be vector. So we're going to go float to vector, plug position into the value, and we're going to be using the index of 0. So let's plug element into geometry. And now we're ready to plug it in. So now we have the information of where to start, and he is the information of where to end, and we're going to plug him into the geometry, and there we go. Now everything is connected. So a very small amount of nodes in order to get this guy to connect all of his friends to all of his friends. That is the basic idea from Zan's tutorial. Now that was a very quick explanation. Definitely go watch his tutorial to get the full range of what's going on. So now we can start to have some fun. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space here because this is going to get pretty nuts. Now, one issue we're going to have is the fact that it's not just one curve. There's actually a curve going this way, a curve going this way, and a curve connecting to itself here. So we need to go ahead and delete those duplicates by getting we're going to get a curve to mesh just to convert it so that this node here can actually read it. So we're going to get a merge by distance node, and all that's going to do is go, all right, all those guys that are way too close to each other, just delete them. That is going to make our scene far lighter and reduce some issues we're going to have later. Now what we're going to do is convert it back to a curve, mesh to curve, so now we can get it to read this next system. And let's just go ahead and duplicate this curve to mesh here. Put it here. Now, I know it can seem kind of arbitrary, but in this case, he was just to convert the curve to be read by him. Now we're going to convert it back so that we can plug a curved circle into it and get some actual geometry that we can read. So I'm going to do 0.005, and there we go. We now have these guys. Now I'm going to get a join geometry node, and we're going to get a instance on points. Plug the instance on points here. Let's get a icosphere for the object that is going to be instance, and we're going to plug merge by distance right into points. And then we'll bring that radius down to something we want. Bring up our subdivision, not too high, just high enough for when we shade smooth, it's not going to be readable. So there we go, something like that. And then if we go here to the wireframe view, what I'm going to do is get another instance on points node. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-Duplicate, or just make sure everything's connected the way it's supposed to be. I'm going to plug this into the join geometry, and then here we're just going to scale it down. And the value of scaling it down here is no matter what we do, they'll all stay the same way that we want. So we're going to do that. And we now have our object ready to go. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to hit Shift and right click, and then we're going to do a set shade smooth and smooth out those spheres. So now that we have these guys, let's go ahead and animate them so we can get that out of the way. So I'm going to hold down Shift and right click to merge them together, and we're going to get a set position node right here. I'm going to give right down here on my frames, give it 300 frames, or really however long you want it to be. So what we can do now is get a noise texture and use the color socket. Don't use factor, that's just going to essentially animate it with 2 axes. The color is going to allow you to animate it a lot more than 1 axis. Axis? Axis. Axis sounds more fun though. All right, on your noise texture, bring it to 4D and then click on normalize to keep it in the middle of your scene. And if you press W, you're going to get that. Now it's kind of erratic. If you bring your detail to 0, that animation is going to be a little bit more satisfying to look at. I'm going to get my scale at 1 to keep it a little bit more satisfying as well. So these are all little tricks you learn on the way. So now that we have this set up, we can go ahead and get this animating and seamlessly looping. This is an extra detail not everybody needs, but I like to get everything to loop perfectly. So we're going to get a mix color, and we're going to plug the color into the color, and we'll get ready now. So I have 300 frames. Your scale is at 1. What we can do now is just go back to frame 0 and make sure your interpolation in your preferences, where's our animation here? Make sure that this is linear. So we're going to hit I on the W, I on the factor. We're going to go to the very end, and I'm going to type in 3 maybe, and then bring the factor over to the right, and then staying here at the very end, hit the W here, go to the very end, and we're going to do a -3. So a negative and positive of the same number is going to keep that looping. All right, here we go. This is pretty slow. Unless I did something wrong. Okay, so it's really slow. We can bring up the scale to maybe 3 on each of these, and that'll definitely speed it up a little bit, but it's really entirely up to you. All right, so we now have our looping noise texture. It's doing that. We can go ahead and get more of these guys, and you'll start to see it gets really, really heavy on your system. So there's a few things that we can do here. One of the things we can do is here on the curve circle, give it a resolution of 4, and that is going to drastically reduce the amount of faces that we're going to be dealing with here. Now also, the more objects, the more insane amount of connections that we have. And for the look of it, I do want to reduce the amount of connections that you can see. So what we can do right here is get a delete geometry node, plug it there, and we're going to get a random value, set to Boolean. That's going to give us just a single value slider. Plug that into the selection, and that will start to delete a lot of these connections, and the spheres being the last ones we delete. So now, just making sure all of them have a connection, we now have this really much more reasonable looking scene to start shading and having a little bit of fun. Speaking of shading, we can now start to add materials to this scene. So we need 3 materials. So we're going to get a set material node on each one of these strings, because each one represents an individual object here. So here in the shading, we're going to get 3 materials. We're going to get the first one, call that one wire, and that we can just grab right here for this top section where you can see the curved and mesh stuff. Now we need to go ahead and get our glass, and we can grab him here, because he represents the larger sphere, and then we need to get the light. So the light, and we can grab that here. So now we can go ahead and get these, we can get these looking good. So first off, the wire, I'm just gonna keep it as sort of the basic white principled color. For the glass, we are gonna go here, I'm gonna bring my roughness down, and then on the transmission, bring that all the way up, creating it as glass. And then on the light, leave it here, and then on the emission field, just give it a strength of like 5, and then give it a nice sort of warm orange color. Now that we're here, I'm going to go here to the camera icon, switch over to cycles, and we can head into the shading tab. So we can head into shading. I'm going to switch over to a cycles view, and we can start to see, hey, these guys are hanging out together, and this is really cool. What I want to do is have some of these wires have a random emission material on it, and I want these spheres to have some roughness, some interesting roughness stuff happening. So I'm going to switch over to click off scene world scene light so I can see it more clearly. So here you can hit this drop down and go here to glass, and let's go ahead and get some roughness magic happening on it. So we'll click on the color ramp, plug that into roughness. We'll get a noise texture. We're going to plug factor into noise texture, and then I'm going to hit Control T with the node wrangler and choose object. Now what we can do is maybe bring my scale down to like 2, bring this in, bring that in, and then you'll start to see some roughness stuff happening. Maybe if I bring this up a little bit. Now I want you to notice something. I'm just going to click this. You don't have to follow along. Notice the same pattern is on every single one of our instances, because Blender is recognizing that it's one object we're instancing multiple times, so it's going to just treat it like one object, and that pattern is also multiplied multiple times. There is a really easy workaround for this, but because the spheres are moving, that easy version isn't going to work, and you've seen me do that on the channel before, but now we have to do a slightly more complicated workaround. We're essentially going to trick Blender into giving each one of these spheres a slightly different pattern. So we have to go back to geometry nodes and get the shading to recognize that there are individual objects. The way we're going to do that is find the line where the glass is happening, and we're going to get a store named attribute node. We want it to recognize the instances, and we're going to get a random value node right here, and we're just going to type R as the name of our instance. And so now we can go ahead and call that attribute in the shader. But again, we're getting a random value assigned to each one of these objects. So let's go back to shading. I'm going to get a attribute node. We want it to recognize instances, so the instancer, and then we're going to hit R for the name of it. So if I just go ahead and view this, notice every one of these objects has a slightly different shade of black and white to them. So that means we can actually plug that into our noise texture. So what we can do is switch this color ramp, there's a noise texture here, over to, so what I can do now, I'm gonna view the noise texture now. You don't have to follow along, just go ahead and plug in things that I'm plugging in. So here is that noise texture that's getting duplicated. What we can do is plug this factor into the 4D. So switch your noise texture to 4D and plug factor into W. And now it's going to slightly move them, but some of them are still going to be exactly the same. It is doing its job. I want it to do its job a little bit more. So we're going to get a math node and set this to multiply add. And what I want to do is multiply that effect, and then the add, that's just the W. So you can still move it around a little bit. But now, because we essentially assigned a different W value to every single one of these spheres. Now they're all going to be different and they can still animate with their noise pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and view the principled again. And now we have that. I'm going to bring that detail. I'm going to bring my detail up to 12, bring my roughness up, and we now have spheres with some roughness magic on them. So it's going to look really, really nice. Now we have to tackle some of these wires having randomly having an emission material. So we would have to go here to this slot, go to this slot, and we need to go ahead back into the shader here. And on one of these glasses, just go ahead and grab the wire material so that we can actually grab him up here. So I'm hit the period key. There we go. So here on the emission, I'm going to give it an emission of like 3. We can see, okay, we can make them bright, but I don't want all of them. So I want to use an attribute to assign a random value to each one of these wires so that we can use a color ramp and just make some of them bright and some of them just normal. So what we can do is go back into geometry nodes. And right here before the mesh to curve, we're going to get a store named attribute. We're going to tell it to recognize the splines. We're going to get a random value and just type in S for spline for our name. We'll leave it here. We'll go back to shading and we're going to get a color ramp. Plug this into the color and we're going to get our attribute. Type in S, and I think we got to keep it on geometry if I'm remembering properly, and then just plug factor here. And then now if we bring down our color ramp, you'll see some of them have the emission and some of them don't. So here in the wire material, I do want to sort of eyeball the bright material that we're using. So it looks like something like that. And then if you bring up your brightness, some of these wires randomly will have that brightness on them. I think these wires are a little too thick, but we will fix that in a little bit. We're now ready to light this and be finished. So let's head back into geometry nodes. I'm going to go here into cycles. So you can see some of these wires are really bright, kind of exposing how thick they are. So here in the curved circle, I'm going to bring them down to like 0.001 maybe 0.002. There we go. We now have that. I'm going to go and grab more on the density because I want a lot more of these spheres. And then we can go back to shading and go, all right, I think the strength is too bright on our wires. There we go. And then I would say, do I want fewer? Something like that looks really good. Okay, so now we're ready to light this and be finished. So I'm gonna go and pick my camera angle. So something like this. We're gonna introduce our camera and hit Control-Alt-0, snapping that to view. And then in the camera settings, I'm going to go here to 85 on the lens. I do want it to just be feel a little bit more flat. And then let's go ahead and get a light. So in the world settings, we're going to bring our brightness to 0. We're going to go and get a area light. And I'm going to hit G and move it up. Hit the light settings, go to a disk, bring up the power of them. And then it's not going to look quite as good until we give it a slightly blue color. And in the world, we'll go ahead, click on the volume and get a principled volume node, and then just bring that density to something really, really small. Something like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and get a render region. So this is kind of the final look here. We can just kind of play around with it and see how we like it. Moves around, looks nice and weird and gross and organic. Maybe bring my camera up like this maybe. And there we go. This is our animation. We're done. So let me show you how to export this and we'll be on our way. I would strongly recommend using a PNG sequence and then just compiling that PNG sequence. If that's the case, go ahead and create a new folder and select that folder here. If you just want Blender to output a finished MP4, I would go from PNG to FFmpeg video, encoding to MP4, and then medium quality to perceptually lossless. In your settings here, I'm going to give my samples at 400 denoised, and then render animation. And when you're done, you'll have something really cool like mine. So that's it. That's how we create it. This was a really dense tutorial, but these geometry node tutorials are starting to get a little bit more advanced as you guys are starting to kind of grow with me. At least I feel like You guys are growing with me as the channel is older and older. So if you guys like these detailed tutorials, I'm gonna keep them coming. If you want some more simple stuff, I can certainly do that. But this was really, really fun. Again, huge shout out to Zan3D's tutorial. Go subscribe to him. Go watch his video. Again, I'm currently running a discount on my Patreon. So if you want to get 20% off an annual subscription, you can go ahead and check that out now through January. So hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.